lions. Yeah, like Lollapalooza lions. Hey, it was pretty loud. I could hear it, like I said, I could hear it in LaGrange Park, so they must really have been jamming out there. All right, so again, welcome, and also to our folks on Facebook. So, will you pray with me, please? God, who sends rest and healing, may my words be those you would have me speak. Open our hearts as we speak and hear to do that which is pleasing to you. Amen.
Amen.
So first I want to give us a little more background on Jewish Sabbath thought and practice, or at least what we think it was like in Jesus' day for most Jewish people. Remember, there were different forms of Judaism then, just as there are now. As a matter of fact, I took a course in seminary on the different kinds of Judaism that were present in Jesus' day. So, and just like today, some were more observant and some were less observant. So remember, this is very general. But the commandment is to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, and it's in the Genesis account of creation. God rested on the seventh day, and thus created the Sabbath day, or the day of rest. And as is human nature, people began to ask questions about what exactly that meant to rest. They couldn't do absolutely nothing, of course, because they had animals to take care of and meals to prepare, and maybe, during the harvest they had harvest to get in or crops to plant or whatever. So what can we do? What counts as rest and what doesn't? What's work? So customs and rituals and so on began to be created and to arise, and we still have many of those today. Prayers welcoming the Sabbath and saying farewell to the Sabbath. This is the opening Sabbath meal, the evening meal on Friday in observant Jewish homes is very extravagant. It's, the Sabbath is considered like a bride. You're welcoming the Sabbath. You hear the idea of a Sabbath day's journey sometimes in the scriptures. The Sabbath day's journey was the distance that you could go before it became a journey. And it's generally about a mile or so. But after that it became a journey, and you weren't supposed to travel on the Sabbath, so that was as far as you could go on the Sabbath. There were also other things. More and more customs were added. In modern times, observant, conservative, Orthodox Jews won't drive on the Sabbath because you have to start the car, and the use of electricity is considered to be parallel to starting a fire, which is forbidden. So they don't start fires, or they don't start their cars. They don't use electricity. They leave lights on and things like that. They've figured out ways around this. So there's a custom in some places of a Sabbath Gentile, which is a non-Jewish person that lives with them or comes into their home to do things like cooking and cleaning up for them. Things that would be considered as work that they're not permitted to do. Now, in Jesus' day, it was a little simpler. The rabbi said that anything that was necessary for the saving of life or preservation of life, like watering a donkey or helping with childbirth, rescuing an animal that had fallen into a well, those sorts of things were permitted. The animal in the well is a famous one. But things like cooking or plowing or threshing or so on were not allowed because they could either be done in advance or they could wait. The idea of Sabbath was to rest, to remember what God had done in creation, to be grateful for that, to think about God, about creation, about the divine, and to simply take time out. It's an enforced rest. Now, we live in a world where we expect to have weekends off, or 2 days off a week anyway, where we have minimum wages and go to work to structured office business style jobs, many of us, with offices and computers and lunch breaks and Social Security and all this, we may have a hard time imagining what it was like in the ancient world when there were no regular, for most civilizations, most countries, nations, religious traditions, there were no specific periodic days off. The Jewish Sabbath was actually an innovation. It was a real innovation. Now, there were feast days in other traditions, celebrations of various events in the lives of the gods and so on. So there were holidays and feasts, and probably several of them a month, and so those were days off, but they weren't days off in the Jewish sense of the Sabbath. It was one day every week where no work was done. And that was in addition to, of course, the Jewish holidays, because those were being added to the calendar too. So a regular day off. That was really quite revolutionary. The commandment was for no one in that household, the Jewish household, to do the work. Not just the family, not just the homeowners or whatever. It was for their servants, for the children, and even the animals. You couldn't rent out, your oxen to plow a Gentile's field, because that was part of your household. Everyone rested, except for the bare minimum needed. You rest, you attend worship services, study, visit with family and friends. That actually wasn't that long ago in the U.S., well, and actually in many Christian nations, where Sunday really still was a day of rest. The so-called blue laws. Anybody remember those? Remember the movie Chariots of Fire? I could use this clip too. Remember in the movie Chariots of Fire, when Eric Liddell, the Scottish runner, who later becomes a missionary to China, one of his heats in one of his races in the Olympics was scheduled to be run on a Sunday. And this was in 1924, the 1924 Paris Olympics. And he said, no, I will not run in that race, even though it means giving up my opportunity to run in the Olympics. The Prince of Wales tried to push him to make an exception. Other Olympic Committee members tried to encourage him to do the same, and he stood very firm. This was what he believed. He was a Christian, it was a Sunday, and he was not going to run, even though he felt running to be a call from God. God had also, he felt, set aside Sunday as a day of rest. There was an accommodation made, another runner switched with him, and so he was able to not run on Sunday. So Sabbath is still alive as we begin to understand that we all need a day of rest. We all need a time to be still and remember who we are and whose we are. This world is so hectic. We always have things going on. There's always, on Sundays there's soccer and the stores are open and so on. We also have to remember that there are some people for whom there is no Sabbath. They have to work 6 or 7 days a week and 2 or 3 jobs just in order to survive. I saw a statistic recently where there is no county in the U.S. where it is possible to rent a 2-bedroom apartment on one minimum wage full-time job. You just can't do it anymore. Not everyone has the opportunity to enjoy the Sabbath. And so we come to Jesus in the synagogue on the Sabbath. He heals the woman with what sounds to me like severe arthritis, and he's scolded for it by the elders, by the leaders in the synagogue. So here's a question. Why did Jesus heal the woman? She didn't ask for it. She didn't come to him and ask for healing. He went to her. And, it was the Sabbath, so he could have put it off to the next day. It was something she'd had for a long time, so it wasn't urgent. It wasn't, that she was dying. So there were all kinds of reasons he could have waited until the next day and gone to her, but he didn't. Well, Sabbath rules tend to be a lot more about what can't be done rather than what can or should be done. Don't cook, don't light a fire, don't walk too far, don't clean the house, don't go to the market, and of course don't do your usual work, planting or weaving or whatever. Instead of not doing something, instead of putting off healing the woman, Jesus does something. He heals her. And that's what Father Henri was talking about in the clip from Chocolat this morning that we saw. Jesus was not about not doing. He was about doing. So instead of not doing, Jesus does. Jesus heals. Now it counts as work because it wasn't needed to save her life. And it was something that could be put off. But rather than a negative of refraining from something, Jesus performs a positive act, doing something. So what does this mean for us today? After all, we don't keep a formal Sabbath anymore. I have to admit, maybe I'm old-fashioned. Every once in a while I hear about a doctor or a clinic that has hours on Sunday, and I'm like, what? It's Sunday. But people, they do, because sometimes that's the only day that people have free. Now, when I lived in Germany in the 80s and 90s, there were official quiet times. After 10 o'clock during the week, I think it was, and after 11 o'clock on Fridays and Saturdays, and all day on Sunday, when you could not vacuum if you lived in an apartment building. No lawnmowers, no, you couldn't work on your car, you couldn't play loud music, but before 8 o'clock in the morning and after 10 o'clock at night. It was enforced quiet time. And most restaurants, they would be open on Sundays because stores were closed and businesses were closed and doctors did not have hours. So Sundays people spent visiting with friends, going out to a nice midday lunch and then taking a long walk. They might go to the cemetery, things like that. It was a relaxed time. It was a time to take a breath before you jumped into the week. The intent was to do something with that time away from the usual routine of life, to renew and strengthen relationships, to see interesting art, because most of the art galleries were free. The art galleries and museums and the zoo were free on Sundays. So you could go see some art, or hear some good music, or visit the zoo, or whatever, experience nature, read a good book, to become more than they were the day before, to refresh and enrich in order to do. So Jesus' example for us then is not so much about what we don't do, which is work on the Sabbath, but what we do, which is heal whenever we see the need, including ourselves. Take the time to be still, to rest, to be more than we were. And that's the real meaning of Sabbath, not so much to stop doing some things, but to increase our ability to do other things. To show our care of others through rest, theirs and ours, through learning, which enables us to understand more of the world, and through building relationships. Those things to do are caring for other people, supporting our loved ones, and taking care of ourselves. So it's not what we keep from doing that makes the Sabbath. It's what we decide to do. Sabbath can open our hearts and minds to understand what it is God intends for us to do. And this is our work in reality. To reach out, to care for others, to help others be everything they can be, to help the ones who are in need of our love and encouragement. We know Jesus' command to feed the hungry, bring water to the thirsty, clothe the naked, to visit the sick and imprisoned. Sabbath helps us to fulfill it. So on Sabbath, we can rest. We can be open to God's Spirit, and we can reach out to heal pain, loneliness, despair, thirst, to be present for those who are sick or in prison. That is our Sabbath work. And that is the work Jesus did and that he asks us to do in all God's names. Amen.
Amen.